Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. So today we've got another piece that we're going to be putting on our 2019 300XE KTM. Today we're going to be installing the Works Connection rear axle block kit. This comes in multiple colors: red, silver, black, blue, or orange. I picked black. What it does is it turns your rear axle from a fixed block kit, so it's a fixed axle, it turns it into a floating rear axle, which is what racers prefer. Gives you a little bit better traction, adjustability, and obviously the bling factor is cool. These weren't very expensive and they're not very hard to put on, so we're going to show you how to do that right now. Alright, so the first step to getting your axle block kit installed here is to go ahead and remove the rear tire. We've got our new chain and sprocket on the rear here, and we're going to use a 32mm socket with a breaker bar to go ahead and remove the stock axle nut on the passenger side of the bike. Alright, there's the rear axle nut. Here is the passenger side block. And now that we've got that off, we can go ahead and, with the bike on the stand here, we can go ahead and slide this rear axle out while holding the tire up. Alright, now that we've got the tire off, we're going to put this aside and we're going to take our new parts and our axle over to the bench vise, and we're going to use some soft jaws and some basic hand tools, and we're going to get this kit installed. Alright guys, so now that we're over here at the bench vise, what I've done is I've bought some L-shaped aluminum here, just a piece of channel aluminum. It's a little more than 1/8 of an inch thick, and what I did was this was less than $10 from Lowe's. I cut two 6-inch pieces to use in my vise as soft jaws because the parts that we're working with are aluminum and we don't want to mar them up. So now that you've got your soft jaws installed, if you don't have soft jaws, you can use the aluminum. If you do have soft jaws for your vise, then just use those. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Now that you've got your vise open, you're going to go ahead and take your rear axle with the stock spacer, or the stock rear axle block, and you're going to go ahead and insert this in the vise. Okay, now that you've got your axle in the vise, you're going to go ahead and open up your Works Connection package. You're going to go ahead and use the square tool that they provide and thread that on to your axle. Okay, now that you've got the square tool threaded all the way onto your axle, you're going to take your stock rear axle nut and you're going to go ahead and thread that on against the square block. Alright, now that you've got that stock axle nut thread on there, you're going to use a 32mm wrench, or I'm using a C wrench here, and you're going to use a 32mm socket, and you're going to go ahead and tighten the block and the axle nut together. Alright, now that you've gotten both the square tool here and the axle nut tightened together, you're going to go ahead and use your wrench, and you're going to go ahead and turn your axle counterclockwise so that you can thread it out. You can thread the axle out of your stock axle block. Okay, now that we've threaded our axle out of our stock axle block, we can go ahead and remove this from the bike. Alright, now that we've got the stock rear axle block off of the stock axle, we're going to go ahead and open up our Works Connection kit here, and we're going to remove the titanium threaded piece that comes with your axle block kit. And note how it goes in. So it actually goes in from the outside, and the flat sides fit in between the flat parts of this axle block. So we're just going to use the titanium piece here, and we're going to go ahead and put it in the vise, and we're going to have the threaded round section facing us and the flat sides facing away from us. Okay, now that we've got our new titanium threaded piece here in the vise, before we go ahead and thread the axle into it, we're going to go clean these threads up. Use some alcohol or some brake cleaner or something like that, maybe a wire wheel or some Scotch-Brite, and get all the gunk out of this, and then you're going to want to go ahead and liberally apply either red or blue Loctite or some other kind of thread locker to the thread. Okay, now that we've cleaned the threads on our rear axle, we're going to go ahead and use some Loctite here. We're going to go ahead and liberally coat it to the threads before we screw it into the titanium threaded retainer. Now that we've got the axle threaded in as far as we can go with our fingers, we're going to go ahead and use a 32mm socket, and we're going to go ahead and tighten it down just a little bit. The next step after you've hand tightened it is you're going to get your torque wrench out, set it to 70 foot-pounds, and torque it to spec. Okay, now that we've got this axle threaded all the way into the titanium retainer, we're going to go ahead and use our torque wrench, and we're going to torque this down to 70 foot-pounds. Okay, now we've got our axle torqued down to 70 foot-pounds. We're going to go ahead and remove the stock axle nut and remove the square after we remove the axle from the vise so that we don't loosen it from the titanium retainer. Now that we've got the axle out of the vise, we're going to go ahead and use a paper towel or a rag, and we're going to go ahead and clean the excess Loctite off of the axle. You don't want it to contaminate your grease when you reinsert it into the rear wheel. Alright, now that I've got the stock axle out and it's been threaded into the retainer, I'm going to use my 32mm socket and my C-wrench. I'm going to go ahead and remove the rear axle nut. Alright, now that I've got the rear axle nut off, I'm going to go ahead and use my C-wrench again and take the square tool that was provided with the works kit off. Okay, now that we've got the rear axle nut off and we've taken the tool off, we're going to go ahead and put everything together on the rear of the bike. Alright, so now that we're done with the vise, we're going to go ahead and put this axle back together. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our two rear blocks, and you're going to notice that one has an indented round indentation into it. That's the one where the axle nut is going to go. So we're not going to use that one right now. We're going to find the one with the two square sides, and we're going to take our axle. We're going to go ahead and slide that over with the square sides facing the outside of the axle, and we're going to line up our flat sides of our titanium retainer here with this flat things on the axle block. Now, positioning it in the bike, you're going to make sure that you've got the larger flat side facing the front of the bike, because that's going to be rubbing up against the adjustment screw, and the part that says WC for works connection, that's going to be facing the rear of the bike. So now that you've got your axle, you're going to go ahead and put a little bit of grease on it, lube it up, make sure it's clean, lube it up, and have this ready so that when you get your rear tire put on, you can slide it in. So there's different things that you can lube your axle with. I just use general purpose grease, and I get a little bit on my finger. And I'll go ahead and grab the axle and just kind of rub it all over. Now you're going to set your axle aside in preparation to put the rear tire back on. Okay, we're ready to put our rear tire back on, so we're going to make sure that we get the sprocket into the chain while at the same time we get the rotor into the rear caliper here, and so it's a little bit tricky, but just go ahead and pay attention while you lift the tire. Okay, now that you've got the chain back on the sprocket, go ahead and put your axle in. Okay, now that you have your rear axle reinserted, making sure that your WC is facing the back of the bike and that the larger flat spot is facing the adjustment screw, go ahead and insert your new axle block on the passenger side of the bike with the large flat spot facing the adjustment screw facing forward. And it'll have a little bit of a marker here to show you which way is which. Okay, now that you've got both axle blocks on, you're going to go ahead and reinsert your stock rear axle nut. Alright, now that you've got your rear axle nut hand tightened, making sure that the tire is all the way forward and that both axle blocks are making contact with your adjustment screws, you're going to want to torque down your axle nut to the spec as per your bike. In this case, for this bike, the manual spec's 59 foot-pounds for the rear axle. Okay, now that you've got your tire back on here, you're ready to torque your rear axle. I'm going to be torquing to 59 foot-pounds while holding the tire against the front of the bike so that I can make sure that the adjustment screws are contacting the blocks. Alright guys, there you have it. We've got the new Works Connection rear axle block, full floater reinstalled on our bike, and probably took me all of about 25 minutes, 30 minutes with filming. Now that I could do it again without filming, it would probably take me about 15 to 20 minutes. Thanks for watching. Good luck on your project.